afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Sellers, Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, as well as the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Education. The University of Michigan has a long history of supporting scholarly inquiry into questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the university's faculty have made significant contributions through their expertise and commitments in these areas. In addition to scholarly engagement, U of M faculty have also contributed in transformative ways to inclusive teaching and mentoring, as well as impactful service and engagement that has provided greater access and opportunity in higher education. To both honor and build upon the university's legacy of institutional and faculty commitments and achievements in DEI, in 2019, we established the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professorship. These professorships are awarded to exceptional faculty who have throughout their careers demonstrated a commitment to the university's ideals of DEI. They've done so through their scholarship, teaching, as well as their service and engagement activities. The UDSTP is reserved for only the highest level of achievement, and thus these remarkable faculty deserve our public recognition and praise. In addition to recognizing individual achievement in the area of DEI, the UDSTP Professorships Program was created to increase the university's capacity to do such work. These professorships were designed to create a community of scholars who have overlapping scholarly, pedagogical, and service engagement interests that will stimulate exciting new collaborations and synergies. As such, they are granted a special fellow in residence status in the University of Michigan's National Center for Institutional Diversity, where with this status, they will interact with other awardees and faculty fellows, as well as postdoctoral scholars and students. Today's event is the first in a series that will highlight the transformational work and extraordinary contributions to DEI that are made by these outstanding U of M faculty members. I am so personally pleased to be here today and to participate in this program. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Tabby Chavis, who is the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity, as well as Associate Vice President for Research and Professor of Education and Psychology. Professor Chavis will introduce our distinguished speaker and then moderate a Q&A session after the talk. Thank you.
I think I need a little support with the video. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. As a faculty member here at the university and director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity, I'm thrilled that this professorship was created to honor and recognize exceptionally accomplished senior scholars who throughout their careers have made significant contributions to knowledge, innovation, and production, as well as service and engagement in teaching and pedagogy. Each honored university professor in this program has created and led intellectually grounded and impactful work to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in higher education in their disciplines and fields and in a variety of local, national, and global communities. And it is thus consistent with the mission of the NCID, which makes it even more of a pleasure to be a point of connection and community for these scholars. Each year, NCID will host public lectures featuring the work of university diversity and social transformation professors to further elevate and honor their exceptional accomplishments. Today, I am pleased to introduce our inaugural lecture speaker, Professor Sue Dynarski, University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor and Professor of Public Policy, Education, and Economics. Professor Dynarski is a champion of reducing inequality in education through research and public engagement. One of her most recent research endeavors involved the design of an experiment to increase application to the University of Michigan by high-achieving low-income students. This research was the driving force behind the U of M's new Go Blue guarantee, which offers free tuition to all admitted low-income students in the state of Michigan. The method and results of the project were featured in national publications and already have made important impacts, including bringing greater economic diversity to the U of M student body. Professor Dynarski has made it an aim in her career that her scholarship reaches a broad audience and informs practices toward the goal of improving access and success in higher education for low-income students in particular. She's also been a contributor to the New York Times Upshot and has testified in front of both US House and US Senate committees among her many public engagement and impact activities. In the classroom, Professor Dynarski is preparing a new generation of researchers and practitioners committed to impacting research, policy, and practice related to issues such as school accountability, digital learning, increasing graduation rates, student aid, and college mismatch. Professor Dynarski has also mentored dozens of master's and doctoral students who have themselves gone on to make contributions to diversity and social transformation in higher education and in other areas of social policy. Professor Dynarski is a living example of the transformative power of education and is constantly fighting to broaden that opportunity for more students. With that, it is now my great pleasure that I turn the podium, the virtual podium, over to Professor Dynarski, whose talk is entitled Understanding the Effect of the Hale Scholarship on Student Decisions. Sue?
Thank you all for a lovely introduction and opportunity to spend this year in residence with the center. It's been a productive and really enlightening time. So what I worked on this year during my professorship is, and what has been sort of the capstone of my work at University of Michigan, as well as before that, is a project aimed at reducing inequality, income inequality, in who applies to and attends the University of Michigan. So I'm going to show you results of a pilot program that has now been turned into a permanent program, the Hale Scholarship. And being good social scientists, we piloted it in a way such that we could understand whether it worked or not by using a randomized trial to roll it out slowly across the state. And those are the results I'm going to show you now. And so I'm going to share my screen now, and somebody will absolutely tell me if my screen is not advancing as I'm talking. I will start with showing you some statistics here. So you should be seeing a graph of income inequality in BA attainment in the United States. So I've been working on issues related to income inequality, educational inequality for almost 30 years now. Before I entered academia, I was a union organizer, which is a key mechanism. Being in a union is a key way that people advance economically in the United States. My dad was a union steward at the post office, and I'm a first-gen kid. So my dad was a high school dropout, and my mom had some college credits, but did not finish. And what you are looking at here, I'm in here. So this bottom line is a cohort born in the early 60s, and it's arranged by the income quartile of them when they were young people, when they were teenagers. So at the bottom here is the 25% poorest kids, and at the top is the 25% richest kids, and in the middle you get the idea. This other line is for a later cohort. So changes between these two lines are showing us progress or regress. in dealing with inequality in education, in higher education in the U.S. Down here at the bottom, this was my set of peers for kids born in the early 60s in the bottom income quartile. Their likelihood of getting a BA was 5%. And since then, for the most recent cohorts that we can measure, for BA completion, people in the 80s or so, 9%. So not exactly enormous progress there. Where we have seen progress in getting a BA is mostly at the top of the income distribution, right? So it went from 36% to 54% at the very top. And we also saw a substantial rise in the second quartile down. So, and what you can see is, this upward shift is that everyone's getting more BAs. The tilts away of the further tilting indicates that this is becoming more unequal, right? Because this is essentially the slope of BA completion with respect to income. And it looks like it got steeper. And this, I'm an economist, this matters a lot for people's financial well-being. In the US, we've had growing income inequality for over 50 years now. And if you look at where the dividing lines are in our income distribution, the BA is a pretty clear one. Even clearer, in fact, is having a master's degree. So people who have master's degrees are the ones who've been pulling away from everybody else in terms of their incomes. But you got to get a BA in order to get an MA. And a lot of my work is focused on how do we get more equality in who gets a BA. All right. Now, the inequality in BA completion does not appear suddenly. The inequality starts early on. This is information from Michigan, from data at the Michigan Department of Education. I've worked in partnership with them since I arrived here in Michigan in 2008. And so this is data on ninth graders in Michigan, and then following them over time to see if they make it to 10th grade, to see if they make it to 11th grade, to see if they end up enrolling in college. And we've got it separated by whether the kid is eligible for free and reduced price meals, right? So are they getting subsidized meals in school? So this is a proxy for poverty that we can use from the education data. And I'll be using this proxy at several points in this project. So for those who have been eligible for reduced price meals, we can see that, here we are starting with everybody's here in ninth grade, but the gap starts to open up between these two lines pretty quickly. So when we get to, do you graduate high school on time? For the kids who are not subsidized meal eligible, that's about 90%. But for those who are eligible for the subsidized meals, that's around 65%, right? So they're not graduating at nearly the same rate. And then if you look at whether they enroll in college, also a substantial gap. And you could, this is starting in ninth grade, you could take this all the way back to kindergarten, and you can find differences in the outcomes for low-income kids and their peers. So at every point in life, it seems like the gap between low-income kids and others widens. And we need policy to change that at every point in a child's life. One point that I've focused on quite a bit is the juncture of high school to college and deciding whether to go to college and where to go to college. And that's what this presentation focuses on. So where you go to college can have quite a bit of an impact on whether you actually graduate. So these are 4 randomly chosen colleges in Southeast Michigan here. So University of Michigan, Michigan State, Eastern, and Washtenaw Community College. And by, Barron's has a selectivity categorization that it uses, in which University of Michigan is highly competitive, and it's the only highly competitive school in the state. I didn't choose this phrasing. Then Michigan State University is very competitive, Eastern competitive, and then the community colleges are open access, and so they don't actually have a competitive rating. A key thing to notice here is that for University of Michigan, the graduation rate is 91%, while for Eastern it's 41%, And for Washtenaw Community College, 15% end up getting an AA within 3 years. These other statistics are within 6 years do you get a BA. And this maps then into earnings after people leave college, big differences in earnings. And we've got quite a bit of research that indicates that there's a causal impact. You know, these schools, University of Michigan spends a lot more per student than Eastern Michigan is able to, and Washtenaw Community College is able to. So the gaps in resources at the flagship universities versus our community colleges versus our open access four-year institutions is enormous. And those resources seem to have an effect. What do you know? More resources translate into better schooling and a higher likelihood of graduating. So there is research underpinning the idea that if we could shift more low-income students into more competitive and well-resourced colleges, they'd be more likely to graduate. The dropout rate in the US among those who attempt college is 50%. It's more like 2/3 for the lowest income students, 1/3 for the upper income students. So that is where where we lose a lot of students. And a final point is that for low-income students who are high achieving and who can make it into one of the flagships often the cheapest option for them. So here is the actual net cost of attending these institutions for in-state students, and it's the total cost. It's tuition, it's books, it's room and board, and when you add it all up, and take out any scholarships that people get, for students in the range that we're going to be focused on, whose income is $0 to $30,000 a year, their family income is $0 to $30,000. Their net cost is $3,200 at University of Michigan. It's $7,000 at Michigan State. It's $12,000 at Eastern Michigan. All of this is because University of Michigan has raised an enormous endowment from generous alumni and is able to meet financial need completely. And other schools are not able to do so. You have to go to Washtenaw Community College to be paying anything as low as what you would pay at the University of Michigan. So we have a wonderful situation in which for a high achieving low income student, University of Michigan is the cheapest and the best resource institution in the state. But this is the reality that that we're looking at when we compare high achieving students. So this is, I have generally focused on students in every achievement level. University of Michigan, the financial aid office and the admissions office asked for my assistance in helping to increase income diversity at the university, to get more low income students to apply. And so we, with our partners at the state of Michigan, identified a set of students who had GPAs and SATs that made them look like they were good prospects for recruitment by the university. And we then looked at them by whether they were low income or non-low income. And this is, again, are they eligible for subsidized meals in school? And then we looked, if you take a bunch of juniors who are doing quite well in college, in high school, and we look later to see if they go to college at all, there's a 4 percentage point gap in college attendance. 88% of the non-low income students end up going to college versus 84% of the low income students. And if you then sort of look up and go along the competitiveness distribution, so highly competitive or above, do you go to someplace as competitive as the University of Michigan or even more competitive? The gap is 8 percentage points. There is most competitive is Stanford and Harvard. There isn't such an institution in Michigan, but here is University of Michigan. And we considered, looking at these data, this is what we consider to be an opportunity. This 8 percentage point gap showed that there were a lot of well-prepared low-income students in the state who were going to a school less competitive than one they could probably get into and less resourced than they could get into. And I'm going to skip this because it'll take too long to explain, but basically previous evidence had indicated it was the application decision that was critical here. It wasn't that low-income students were applying and being rejected from selective schools. It's that they weren't applying at all. So we needed to find an intervention that was going to catch them before they made the application decision. It wouldn't do any good to send them a financial aid offer after they'd applied and been admitted, because by then you would have lost a lot of people. We needed to get people to apply in the first place. And previous research, some of it mine, had shown that students face a lot of uncertainty in deciding where to go to college. They don't know what their ultimate cost of college is going to be, because you don't get your financial aid letter until after you've applied and been admitted. They don't know whether they can get into a selective institution or whether it's even worth it to do so. I and others have shown that the process for applying for financial aid for college puts people off. The FAFSA is many, many pages. The profile is even more. There are fees left and right. And if you are a first generation student, then getting through this morass is daunting, and we lose a lot of students in the process. Having support from adults is critical, right? So if your parents went to college, well, they help their kids every day do things like register for the SAT and make sure they get their applications in and register for the right types of classes when they're in high school. All of that, if your parent did not go to college, needs to be filled in very frequently by another adult, by a college counselor, by college-going older peers. And we generally don't provide the resources to our schools to provide enough college counselors to do this work. So here's what, in conjunction with the University of Michigan, we piloted, and this is the set of authors, all of them proud Michigan affiliates. So CJ was an MPP student at the Ford School. Catherine Michamore at the time was a postdoctoral student at University of Michigan. And she's now coming back to the School of Public Policy as a professor. And Stephanie Owen is a doctoral student who's just finishing her doctorate and heading to Colby College next year. So what we did, based on the research that I just showed you, was create a simplified early commitment of free tuition and fees at University of Michigan. We were going to tell people up front, if you get in, you're going to get tuition and fees for free. Encourage students to apply. It's going to be called a scholarship, and we're going to tell them they don't have to fill out any forms in order to get this. This is an unconditional promise. They get in, they're going to get the free tuition and fees. And we're going to be delivering this as a commitment to students through a packet that we send to their homes. We'll also send a letter to parents, because the adults participate in these decisions with their children, and a letter to the principal of the kid's school telling them, here are the kids at your school who are going to be getting this offer. This is what the offer looked like when it landed in students' mailboxes. This is not a item designed by an economist. It would be quite ugly if it were. This is something designed by the Department of Admissions here at the university. So the wonderfully talented folks here at the university designed this intervention, informed by the research that we shared with them. And they branded it the HAIL Scholarship, high achieving, involved leaders. And so we get this great big 8.5 by 12, heavy, glossy, maize and blue package, eye-catching to arrive in your mailbox. And when you open it up, it then says it's personalized to each student. Right out off the bat tells them they're going to get 4 years of free tuition. And there's no asterisks on it. If they get in, they're going to get the 4 years of free tuition and fees. Now, we wanted to pilot this and find out if it worked. So if you're piloting something, you're picking a few places to try it out in to see if it works. And we randomly chose a set of high schools in which to start this. An advantage of randomly choosing a set of schools to start this is that we then have a randomly selected set of schools where we're not starting it that form our comparison group. So essentially we have a randomized trial where we're able to see whether the students in the pilot schools are behaving differently from the students in the randomly chosen comparison schools, who in future years would be getting offers of this scholarship. Future cohorts would be getting offered this. So all this started back in the spring of 2015. We identified juniors in Michigan's public schools who met ACT and GPA requirements. It's now SAT requirements defined by the admissions office. This is not a guarantee of admission, remember. This is just a set of students whose scores and grades are sufficiently high that Michigan considers them recruitable. We wound up with Infurple as another name for free and reduced price lunch. Right? These are these subsidized meals in school. So this is our marker for somebody who is a low-income student household in poverty. Each year, there are about 2,000 such students in 500 schools across the state. As context, we've got 1,000 high schools across the state. 100,000 students per cohort. About half of them tend to be low income, as defined by the subsidized meal program. So, you can see we're getting 2,000 out of 50,000 who meet these ACT and GPA requirements, highlighting again that we lose many more students along the way in terms of their preparation, in terms of the schooling that we provide them, the supports we provide them. But we've got a set of students here who have beaten the odds essentially and ended up with grades and GPA that make them good prospects for University of Michigan. And we are going to be focusing on getting them into the most selective school that they can. So we randomized by high school, but basically in a given high school, all of the high achieving low income kids were either going to be offered this program or were not going to be offered the program. And here is our fine state. Here's our mitten and the Upper Peninsula. And each of these dots indicates one of these high achieving low income students. The bigger the dot, the more of them there are. And so you can see down here in Southeast Michigan, there's a concentration in Ann Arbor, Detroit. There's a concentration in Grand Rapids, but then there's lots and lots of tiny pale dots, tiny little dots you might not be able to see scattered across the state, where there's just 1 or 2 or 3 such students in a given high school. So some of the academies in Detroit, you might have 100 high achieving low income students in a given cohort. And in some place in the Upper Peninsula, you might have 1. And it's these students that we were really especially trying to reach. We have wonderful programs that go into these urban schools in Southeast Michigan, but it's, Wolverine Pathways, for example, it is impractical to get to all 1,000 of these schools and to go to each of these schools to reach 1 or 2 students. And we were particularly focused on such students at these distance schools with this intervention. So we sent the packet out. It included a teaser that if they went and they logged in, they would get a free t-shirt, free Michigan t-shirt. And their login information lets us know whether they've gotten the packet, looked at it, and been interested enough to actually go and log into the website. And this is what this shows us here, is that here we have the student letter being delivered in September. This spike, this is each of these points is a first-time visit to the Hale webpage by these students. And we could see a spike. So indeed, they opened it, they looked at it. Why are we doing this? There's a lot of interventions that show 0 impact. And it's hard to tell whether it's because people never even looked at the materials and didn't, even engage with what you sent them, or they looked at it and they weren't interested. This shows that they looked at it and they went and logged on. We see after the parent letter drops, another spike. So the parents were also looking at their letters. So this was an early good sign that something was happening. And the admissions office and the financial aid office were monitoring social media. They do this all the time. So this is College Confidential, where people get together and gossip about college admissions. And this person is saying that they got mail saying that if it got into Michigan, they'll provide me with a Hale scholarship, which will cover my tuition. Obviously, I'm not yet admitted, but is this a good sign that I might be accepted? I know I sound naive, but I do understand colleges do these gimmicks to get students to apply so they can lower their acceptance rate. This student is not naive. They're very sophisticated. There actually are some colleges, unprincipled colleges, that will basically send out application solicitations to just about anybody in order to bump up the number of people who apply so they can look like they have a low acceptance rate. Michigan does not do this. This is not something that Michigan does. This was particularly interesting. I got the same packet, and truth be heard, it stressed me out. I don't even think I had the capability to get through the application process. I wasn't even considering it, but of course now my parents are all gung-ho on me going, I just don't want them to get their hopes up if I'm denied. This joint decision-making, this not wanting to disappoint each other, parent and child, is something that we've seen before in the sociology literature. And in fact, one of my doctoral students, Elizabeth Berland, in the sociology department, is now doing intensive qualitative interviews with students in both the treatment and the control group to get more insights like these about why hail is having the impact on behavior that we are seeing in the data that I'm now showing you. And here's the data I'm now showing you. So what we have here is, do students apply to the University of Michigan? And this group on the right is the group that got the hail packet, and the group on the left got the usual University of Michigan recruitment materials that it sends out. Michigan's great, become a Wolverine, we've got really strong financial aid. This is the promise. These folks are getting the promise. And as you can, so what this says is that 68% of those who receive this promise applied to the University of Michigan versus 26% of those in the control group who got the usual University of Michigan materials, which is obviously an enormous jump. When we heard this, we nearly flipped. So big increase in the application rate, nearly a tripling. This is statistically significant. I'm not going to show you regressions because this is a randomized trial. We can just compare the two groups, a big increase. If you then look at who then ultimately was admitted and who chose to attend, you know, Michigan is a selective school. The admission rates were about the same in the treatment and control groups. And what we ended up with was 27% of the treatment group attending the university and 12% of the control group. There are about 1,000 students each year in each of these groups. So this is 270 students. This is 120 students. The difference is 150 students. So each year, an additional 150 low-income students were attending the University of Michigan because of the Hale Scholarship. So this was a wonderfully astounding and gratifying result. What I just showed you was all based on University of Michigan data. We were waiting with bated breath to get information nationwide about college attendance so we could see whether those students that we were getting to come to University of Michigan were coming to us from, say, Harvard, or were they coming from a community college, right? Because if what we were just doing is sort of shuffling chairs on the deck, that wasn't going to be very useful. So inducing a student who is going to go to Berkeley to instead go to Michigan, not a big accomplishment. Getting a student who would have gone to a community college to instead go to University of Michigan, that is a more substantial accomplishment. So what we found once we looked at these nationwide data, they took about a year to arrive, was that a quarter of the effect that we just saw. So we saw a 15 percentage point boost in the share of low-income students attending University of Michigan. About a quarter of that, 4 percentage points, is actually students who would not have gone to college at all, but they are now going to college. And this was gobsmacking to us, again, because this is a set of students who have really strong academic credentials, but that's what the data are showing. Another quarter is students being shifted from two-year schools, community colleges, to four-year schools instead. So half of it is students who would have gone to community college or not gone to college at all. And the remaining half is students being shifted from less selective institutions than Michigan to the University of Michigan. No evidence at all that we were poaching from any other highly selective or most selective institutions. So that was good news. And other good news is that they are sticking around. So it would not have been good if the students came to the University of Michigan and then immediately dropped out because they couldn't handle the work, the atmosphere, the moving away from home. But what we're finding is that they are persisting, much like other students at the university. I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that show how this varies in terms of geography of the state and demographics of students. So I had said, and I showed you that map that showed students scattered all over the state. And if we look at the effects of the program by where the student's school is located, so if we compare cities to suburbs to rural areas, now the light bar here is the control group. So this is like business as usual. This is what, without the promise, without the Hale Scholarship, how students are behaving. And what we see is that in the towns and in rural areas, that's where we see for the control group the smallest application rate, 16%. In the urban areas, we're actually doing decently well. 46% of the control group is applying, and the suburbs are right in the middle. And then if you look at the effect, it was to largely equalize these huge differences by town, rural versus city, right? So the biggest effect was in the rural areas, those small schools where there's just one or two high achieving low income students. It's a 48 percentage point boost. In the city, it's still a respectable 29 percentage point boost. City urban, and then this then pretty much looks quite similar if you then look at the effects on enrollment, right? So that maps then into race essentially. So, in Michigan, rural poverty is largely white. And our urban poverty is concentrated in the cities. And so if we break this analysis down by race, what we see is that for this particular population, the lowest application rate in the control group is among white students. These are white rural students, 21 percentage point likelihood of applying. Versus for Black students, 48%, Hispanic, 41%, Asian, 60%. All of them saw a substantial boost in their likelihood of application, but the size of the effect is a function of how small was the application rate in the control group. And so the biggest effect that we're seeing here is among white students. We already had a relatively high baseline rate of application among Black students. And so the effect here is 30 percentage points, but versus the 45 percentage points. I made the point in an article that I wrote about affirmative action and efforts to race-based affirmative action and efforts to replace it with some sort of class-based affirmative action. And made the point that if you try to use income as a proxy for race in trying to diversify your class, it won't work because the majority of low-income students are white. Blacks and Hispanics are disproportionately likely to be low income. But if you look at the population of low income students, they are disproportionately white. So anything that focuses on income per se is not going to serve the same purpose as a program that deliberately attempts to provide affirmative assistance to Black or Hispanic students. So, the implication of this is that, of what we found, is that, providing certainty in the financial aid process can really alter low-income students' decisions. And that free college programs out there in the world, we hear the phrases free college quite a bit. They could be quite successful at increasing access, but the details matter a lot. Right, so we provided a very simple guarantee upfront, and that's not what all free college programs look like. The design is going to matter. Now, somebody speak up for a second and tell me how much more time I have, because I'm not looking at my watch. Anybody?
I think you have about 10 more minutes, Sue.
All right, so let me dive a bit more into this. So we've continued to work with the University of Michigan in rolling out the Hale Scholarship to more and more high schools. With this cohort this year, it's at every high school in the state. But over the past, since 2015, we just were gradually adding schools as we were learning about the program and how to tweak it. And so we've used this opportunity to get some further insights into what it is about the intervention that's making it work, right? So there's a lot of free tuition programs running around now, so Harvard's got free tuition for families earning under $60,000. Various Democratic presidential candidates were embracing free college. New York State has a program of free tuition for students above a certain income level. There's free college based on where you live and go to school, like the Kalamazoo Promise. UW-Madison has a program not unlike the Hale Scholarship called Bucky's Tuition Promise. So lots of programs, but the details matter. So here's Stanford's program. Tuition is covered for parents with income below $150,000. So at Stanford, if your income is lower than $150,000, they will guarantee that your tuition and fees are free. In Michigan, the Go Blue Guarantee makes that guarantee for $65,000 or below. So that's a headline, but the footnote is that's under certain conditions, right? So for parents with total income below $150,000 and typical assets for this income range, and an expected parent contribution that is low enough. So they're basically saying you need to fill out the financial aid forms in order to get this and have it confirmed, right? So it's guaranteed, but with an asterisk. So it's basically information. It's a way to try to simplify messages about aid without actually making a commitment about aid. So these students have to fill out these forms and submit them in order to then be told that they're actually going to be eligible for these scholarships. And the Go Blue Guarantee is structured the same way. So the Go Blue has the income cutoff is $65,000, but you need to have assets that are not too high, and you need to fill out the FAFSA and the profile in order to find out whether your expected parent contribution is low enough that you're going to be eligible for the aid. So, so what we did in a recent cohort of students was we had our usual control group, and we had our students getting the Hale offer, which in this particular year looked like this. If you get admitted to Michigan, you're getting free tuition. So Hale Scholarship is an unconditional individual early guarantee of tuition to low-income students. We also told them about the Go Blue Guarantee, which was introduced in the wake of the Hale Scholarship. So after the first couple of years of Hale, it was clear it was having an enormous impact. And the university wanted to expand this in some way. And so hit upon guaranteeing for students from families with below median income in the state, which is about $65,000, that they would be able to get free tuition. But it's got asset limits, and you need to fill out the forms to confirm your eligibility. So it's not quite as clear a guarantee as Hale is, which is if you get in, you get it no matter what. In this case, you need to fill out the forms in order to confirm that you're actually going to get it. And this is what their offer looked like in this particular cohort. So we had 1/3 kids getting the Go Blue Guarantee materials, 1/3 of them getting the Hale materials, and the rest were just getting the usual University of Michigan materials, which mention affordability and talk about how great the university is and how generous its aid is. And we did a horse race between the three of these. Because we weren't, some people had, as we presented the information about the Hale Scholarship Program, we'd had people say, well, maybe it's just that people are getting this big maize and blue package in the mail with their name on it. And that really is what's encouraging them to apply. It's not the scholarship. So what we're doing is sending to students a big maize and blue package addressed to them, which contains information about the Go Blue Guarantee. So we're sort of equalizing that between the two groups. If you look at what we're testing two models for free tuition, right? So for the Hale Scholarship, everyone in this group is low income, and they're all going to be eligible for need-based aid that you get through the FAFSA and the profile. they're really all, in theory, eligible for the Go Blue guarantee, right? They can apply, they can fill out their forms, and then they'll get the Go Blue guarantee if they meet the criteria. For our pilot students, they're getting a mailer from us. Everyone's getting general information about aid. Our HAIL and Go Blue students are getting personalized information about aid. It's that you are likely eligible, or you are definitely eligible for tuition and fees. They're getting an encouragement to apply. Everybody is. The HAIL students are getting a guarantee of aid, and they're having the FAFSA and the profile waived. Right, so everybody's getting this sort of baseline stuff here. The HAIL group is getting this set of materials. And if you compare the HAIL students to the Go Blue students, the difference is this, right? So the difference, the difference is these last two things, actually, right? The difference is the guarantee of aid and the waiver of the FAFSA in the CSS profile, right? So that's going to be the key difference between the HAIL group and the Go Blue group. They're both going to get lots of glossy materials, but just HAIL is going to get the guarantee and the waiver of the financial aid forms. Again, same type of sample as before, about 2,000 students from about 500 schools. And here's what we found. So the students who got the HAIL offer, 63% of them applied. In the control, 35% applied. You might remember, if you got a good memory for numbers, that in the results I just showed you for the first two HAIL cohorts, this is pretty spot on, was 68%, I think. The control here, though, is higher than it was in terms of the application rate. And we think that actually is because, in part, that the Go Blue scholarship has been advertised so widely, right? So the knowledge about Go Blue has increased, we believe, the application rate among even those students to which we were not sending mailers. We're pursuing investigating this in another paper. And these are the students who got the personalized Go Blue, right? So here's the comparisons we can make. So the HAIL versus control group, a 28 percentage point boost in the likelihood of applying to the University of Michigan. To be clear, if all of these students knew that they were going to be eligible, we're going to be able to get the Go Blue, if they felt completely confident about it, this should be zero, right? So, the fact that we are guaranteeing it, though, without requiring the application, clearly makes an enormous difference. If we then compare the control to the personalized Go Blue, it's an 8 percentage point increase. So substantial, but not nearly as large an effect. So 8 percentage points would be considered a big impact in many policy contexts. It's just that the HAIL guarantee has such an outsized effect that it kind of it overshadows it. And then in terms of attendance, the impact of HAIL for this particular cohort was 9 percentage points. For the personalized GBG, it was basically zero. So we ended up with no effect on attending the University of Michigan for those students who were offered the personalized Go Blue information. So concluding, this is the real conclusion, from that in the previous work, we really have determined, I think rather conclusively, that the power of free tuition programs lies in their simplicity. And if you lose that simplicity, you lose their effectiveness. You need to have a guarantee up front. Any free college programs that attach strings are going to be less effective, and those can take the form of asset limits, EFC requiring forms. And the key is shifting uncertainty about aid from the student to the institution, right? So if you've got some sort of proxy to identify high need students, in our case, it was subsidized school meals, but you could just as easily use household eligibility for Medicaid or for SNAP. And based on that, make an unconditional tuition guarantee upfront to that family. Now, there's going to be some slippage because some students who were on Medicaid when they applied are not the following year going to still be on Medicaid and will no longer be eligible for the same type of aid that you would have given them through the traditional system. But basically, the institution needs to absorb that uncertainty. And what we have found, it's in the paper at my website, the students who were made the Hale offer ended up getting the same financial aid as the students in our control group. Michigan has extremely generous need-based aid for students. So the Hale students were just being guaranteed upfront what they were going to be getting in expectation if they filled out their forms. It's just that we shifted the certainty about this forward. We, as an institution, we said, okay, we will take the risk on this and we'll guarantee you that you're gonna get free tuition and fees. And in the end, it has turned out to be a costless program on a per student basis, because students are just getting the financial aid they would have anyway. They just got guaranteed the aid up front instead of being given sort of a hemming and hawing about whether they were going to be able to get free tuition and fees. And all of this is done in partnership with the University of Michigan, as I said at the start, as well with our partners at the Michigan Department of Education and Center for Educational Performance and Information. Institute of Education Sciences provided financial support, and of course, none of what we're doing reflects their positions or policies. They make us say this stuff. And that is it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dynarski.
Thank you, Dr. Schaus.
I'm going to, I'm always excited when I hear about this research. But I'm going to start with some questions that have been submitted by attendees. And I guess one is related to the earlier data that you presented in some of your earlier slides, is the WCC, Washington Community College, 15% AA graduation rate affected by the fact that a number of their students transfer to a four-year university before they get the degree, or does your work take that into account?
Those statistics that I showed there were from the national scorecard that the U.S. Department of Education maintains, and it basically integrates that in. There's some transfer onto, so that 15% is getting a 3-year degree within, a 2-year degree within 3 years. It doesn't change a whole lot if you bring in, do they later get a BA? The transfer rates from community colleges to 4-year institutions and subsequent graduation rates are really low in Michigan. We have one of the more difficult states when it comes to students being able to carry credits between schools, right? We don't have a higher education coordinating board that does that kind of work. We don't even have a community college system, right? We've just got a bunch of highly independent institutions running around, and that makes it pretty hard on the students. Someplace like, say, California has guarantees that if you earn a certain associate's degree at their community colleges, you're guaranteed 2 years of credit at the state universities, for example. And I think we really need something like that. What we're basically showing with this study is, it's important, and it's an important decision to go to a highly resourced institution in our state, because there is such disparity in how many resources our institutions have. I would love to instead make it that all the institutions are highly resourced, and so this is not such a high stakes decision, but given the context that we're in, this is what we were able to do.
Another question is a broader kind of commentary. Could you comment on the impact of many competitive and highly competitive institutions going standardized test optional as opposed to test blind on income diversity in admissions? This year, as context in the wake of COVID and with the SAT administrations being canceled, ACT being canceled, a lot of schools that have been toying with going test optional all of a sudden went test optional because people didn't have tests. Most students were not able to take the SAT who wanted to, and ditto with the ACT.
So it's not as if we've got a couple of things going on right now. It's not just that the test scores are optional, but we're in the midst of a pandemic and an enormous depression. So it's really hard to conjecture right now. I can say that what we're seeing as a result of the pandemic and the subsequent recession is a big drop off in the attendance of low income and underrepresented populations at college. Community college enrollments have dropped 20%, right? And it's concentrated among Black, Hispanic students that drop. By contrast, if you look at the most selective schools, their application rates have doubled or tripled. So crazy effects. There are two different worlds right now, just like there are two different economies right now. In college applications and admissions, the world is very different for upper income students versus lower income students. So in steady state, maybe I could conjecture what's the test optional is going to mean. In the current context, I'm happy to say when I don't know something, and I don't know.
If you knew that would, yeah, you could make a lot of money if you knew that right now. But I know that's not your motivation.
It is not.
I'm going to I'll go to the next question. This speaks to, I think, one of the slides that you presented earlier around how Hale Scholarship students are faring, but a challenge to this, to what you presented. As data available to us from the state of Michigan, i.e. lack of GPA, SAT scores in recent years changed, why didn't the research approach pivot to account for this? This questioner says that in recent years, the number of unqualified students receiving the Hale Scholarship has been difficult to reconcile as ethical. Given the data that you presented, I guess I'm curious about how you would respond to that kind of view.
Sorry, I didn't understand the last question.
So I guess the second part of the question was a view that there are unqualified students that have been receiving the Hale Scholarship in increasing numbers.
That's not what our data indicates. So what it means for an unqualified student to receive Hale is that they were receiving free and reduced price lunch as a junior, but when we actually and by the way, I didn't show these numbers, but once we admit students, we get like 99% of the students to fill out the FAFSA and the profile, because students can get even more aid beyond the Hale Scholarship if they fill it out. But we wait until we admit them and we've got them in our embrace, and our bureaucracy goes to work and make sure that they get their forms done. Once they do their forms and we look at their aid packages, the aid packages for the Hale students look pretty much identical to those for the non-Hale students. So we are not seeing evidence and in both groups, there tends to be some quote unquote slippage where there are students who had looked like they were low income early on, but then are not eligible later on. So it's in the paper. The data about this is available to us as researchers, and there is no increase in the share of non-eligibles among the Hale students.
I guess I want to direct, I think, the first part of the question, which was about as data available to us from the state of Michigan, in this case, the lack of GPA and SAT scores in recent years.
Right. So we have SAT. So what's changed in Michigan? So Michigan, when we started, had a data system in place that allowed us to calculate students' GPAs statewide. It was called the Student Teacher Data Link. And it basically let you, it was as researchers, all this is anonymized, and it's only to qualified researchers who can work with these data. But we were able to identify students' GPA as well as their SAT. The SAT is universal in Michigan. People take it in the schools. It's provided for free during the day. And it's part of the testing, the sort of NCLB ESA testing that the state of Michigan does. This year, so several years ago, they stopped doing that teacher-student data link. So we lost access to high school transcripts. And then this year, of course, the SAT fell apart, right, because of COVID. So for this year's Hale operation, we were able to make use of scores from earlier in high school. So from sophomore year that students took. And in fact, they took it at an even higher rate than they had taken the SATs. So pretty universal coverage on that. And we're just doing without the GPA information at this point. Unless the state starts to gather it again, we're working without it.
You mentioned, and I thought one of the slides you presented a number of free college programs, and this questionnaire asks, do you have comparative data with any of those programs, such as the Kalamazoo Promise comparison, or the other free college programs that, like the Stanford one and the like too? Is there comparative data that is telling us something about the broader impacts, or that's something that's distinct about the Michigan program?
There's been several research papers at this point on the Kalamazoo Promise that show that it's been effective in getting more students to go to college and complete college. The Kalamazoo Promise is one of the more unconditional promises. If you basically go through the Kalamazoo schools, you're going to get free tuition and fees at any Michigan school. So I consider that as one of the more simple guarantees as compared to, say, the Stanford program. I have not seen research like that I just showed you for the University of Michigan for someplace like Stanford or the other schools. So that Michigan engaged in this sort of social science research while it was working on its policies is an enormous credit to the institution, and it's not common enough. I would like to see more such data, but it's not as common as it should be. I would like to make it more common.
Next project. No, I know you have many next projects in mind, but we've actually gotten a few questions about gender. And so because one kind of set generally asks the question of whether you've observed any gender effects in the impacts of Hale Scholarship, I guess, and what types of things would you expect, given the demographics of the state and patterns and behaviors of college application, et cetera.
Right. So the population that we were working with was majority female, because when you look at academic achievement among high school students, girls are doing better, right? So if you're going to select a population of students based on their SAT and their GPA, you're going to end up with slightly more girls than boys. And that indeed is what this population was like. If you then look at what the effect of the intervention was within that population, it seemed to encourage, if you looked at before, for the control group essentially, boys were slightly more likely than girls to apply. And that flipped with the offer of the scholarship. So, and this matches with other research folks have done showing that girls tend to be less confident than boys, even if they have the same academic achievement. So it seemed to encourage the girls to apply in a way that it did not affect the boys. The differences are not enormous, though. Again, they're in the paper. They're in the paper, but they're not enormous differences.
Another question is from a follower and a fan, it seems, and it says, I know you've been active in encouraging greatly simplifying the FAFSA form. Do you see any progress federally on this issue? So
there is. So in the last legislation that passed, the stimulus bill, in it was also continuing funding for a whole lot of programs, including the Department of Education, and it included a massive simplification of the FAFSA. So this had been Lamar Alexander's baby for years. So I started working on, simplifying the FAFSA, ideally eliminating the FAFSA and just, based on tax data, identify who's eligible for aid instead of making people apply, or, if they're eligible for SNAP, make it automatic. The form had about 100 questions lopped off of it. So the FAFSA is going to get shorter. All of this then depends on how the Department of Education executes this. It's been told to do this, and how are they going to do it? Are they going to make it as easy as possible? During the Obama administration, they had actually, without legislation, done a lot to simplify the process of applying for college. And so I'm hoping that the Biden administration is going to be doing something similar, but now armed with also legislation that lets them do even more. Some good news.
Some good news. We can, and we can use that these days too. No, I wasn't aware of the change. So
Yeah, it kind of got buried by everything else in the legislation.
Another question is, given increasing awareness of the ways in which many students are experiencing food and housing insecurity, what are the limits of the Hale Scholarship and financial aid more generally, and how might these concerns impact student yields? I think, the question here is, I don't think you would think that the Hale Scholarship achieves or covers everything that relates to students' access and success in higher education, particularly those from lower income backgrounds. So what else is needed? And then I guess, do you see any limitations in the Hale Scholarship in addressing access? So what are things that you would like to see, further built or, expanded on in that space? So I guess there are two parts to that. Are there things about the Hale Scholarship program that you would like to see enhanced, expanded, and then what else is needed in this line?
So Hale is essentially delivering to students the financial aid that they were going to be eligible for anyway, right? And Michigan is pretty generous on that aid within the parameters set by the federal government, right? So if you are giving somebody a Pell Grant and a loan, a federal loan, for example, you can't go above the budget that the federal government sets for a student, right? You can't be offering more than they would be qualified for. It's not equalizing incomes. It's not equalizing parental support. Right? It's not changing families' income situation. There's evidence that people have found that when low-income students get their Pell Grants at the start of the year, it's often distributed to their family members, to help with rent, right? And so that kind of inequality is still going to exist, even if you've equalized their schooling costs in some way. You haven't changed the lives of their family members. And so what do you need? You need a robust safety net that is taking care of those families so that college students aren't trying to take care of their families with their scholarships. Right? So, until we solve the broader problems of poverty and inequality in our society, we're not going to have as many high achieving low income students as we should. And those who do make it to college are going to have a more stressful life. The colleges can do more to try to make it easier to be a low-income student. Some of them have done things like, provide winter coats to students when they're coming from warmer climes, right? Because those down coats don't come cheap, right? So just automatically providing what you need to live someplace like Michigan. Automatically giving scholarship students access to tickets, to football tickets, to play tickets, through a portal, right? So that they can kind of do the same sorts of things that other students do and engage in the same sort of lives. So yes, there is more that could be done once students actually get here.
Thank you. I think you had just addressed a couple of the next ones about what else do we need besides the tuition scholarships as well. I'm going to joyously go to the next question, which is from a student who has been inspired by seeing you and your work unfold during their time here at U of M, and even greater to see how rigorous research can be applied to improving access. This student is glad that you mentioned the Go Blue Guarantee and other promise institutional and geographic zones, and how these programs are similar and different. Question here is, one of the mechanisms with the Hale Scholarship that I haven't seen directly addressed is the identity of being a Hale Scholar, where the other programs do not have an identity attached. Do you think there's anything about this mechanism and as an impact mechanism, and has it been explored maybe in the qualitative work that you've done, or how do you see that actually impacting the effectiveness of Hale versus other programs, that may be less effective?
We based on research before our own, we had identified it as a scholarship, and we called it a scholarship as opposed to a need-based grant, right? The Hale materials that we sent out didn't anywhere say, hey, you're low income, therefore you're going to get a lot of aid. That wasn't part of the messaging. It was, you are terrific and here's a scholarship. And that was because previous research had shown that if you offer, and this is work done by Caroline Hawksby and Chris Avery, had gathered financial aid offer letters from thousands of students and then seen where they ended up going to school and analyzed what in the offers seemed to be associated with students choosing a given school. And if you take the same amount of money, the same grant that somebody doesn't have to pay back, and you brand it a grant versus a scholarship, the students were more likely to respond to the scholarship than to the grant. So framing matters, because we notice from the sociological literature, are you, with the scholarship that you're offering somebody, highlighting their identity as a scholar, or are you highlighting their identity as a low-income student, as a low-income student, right? So, and those identities trigger behaviors and responses. So we were quite deliberate in calling it the Hale Scholarship. You know, the last year stuff where we compare the Go Blue guarantee to the Hale, that's part of the difference between the two. You know, one sort of highlights incomes and the other one does not. But we haven't done anything experimental in particular that gets at this. The qualitative interviews we're doing, that Elizabeth Berland is doing, are getting at this question.
No, that's, yeah, someone who studies identity. That was fascinating. So I will look eagerly at that, and particularly salient thinking about the emphasis on students' identities as scholars, given the potential unintended undermining effects of emphasizing, trying to support students who are coming from underserved communities, but not stigmatizing identities, unintentionally too. I guess what a couple
the First Gen Center that opened up, right? There wasn't a First Gen Center when we started this. And one opened up at the university a couple of years later because the students were demanding it. And I got to think that the Hale students were probably a big chunk of that, because there were, a big bump in the number of First Gen students at the school. And there wasn't any place sort of for them. So I've heard about the Hale students being noisy, about asking for stuff. And I say, go Hale students, be noisy and ask for stuff.
Just as other students ask for things and get them when they deserve them. So
exactly, being noisy is how you get heard.
Are there requirements attached to the Hale Scholarship? I guess the one question asker is asking about minimum GPA requirements.
No more than any other student, so all students at the university, if you fall below like a D or something, then there's a trigger where the federal aid can be in trouble. But it's nothing that, there are no extra requirements. They don't have to maintain a certain GPA while they're in school.
Another question is, I guess a question about the race ethnicity effects that you found. White students are a majority of low-income students, so more in absolute numbers of white students benefit, right? So this person is trying to clarify kind of your interpretation. But students of color are disproportionately low income, so doesn't Hale also increase the number of admitted students who are students of color?
Yes, it does, but it increases even more the share, right? So yes, it has an effect on the students of color, and adds to the number of them who are at the university. It also adds more white students. So it's not decreasing the number of Black students at the institution. It's just not increasing as much as the white students. And this would depend, in a state in which rural poverty was not white, I suspect the effects would be different. So if you were doing this in Texas, where rural poverty is Hispanic, I suspect that you would see much larger effects for rural Hispanics than for urban Blacks, right? So we need another context in which to do this, to untangle the geography from the race, essentially, and ethnicity. Again, I'd like to do this someplace else. So if you have a university that would like to do something terrific like this, please get in touch.
And I was also, I know we've had a side conversation about, areas that don't have the same kind of restrictions related to affirmative action bans, and so the ability to kind of engage in race and socioeconomic status more explicitly. So
Yes.
Lots of mini reams of future research from this.
Yeah, so in Michigan, by law, University of Michigan is not allowed to recruit based on race, right? So do admissions based on race. We couldn't target Hale by race, but in another state that doesn't have such restrictions, you could. So you could decide you wanted to increase your ethnic and racial diversity and target students with an unconditional offer of tuition based on whatever you would like to base it on. In your particular context, shift your admissions.
There's another question. I think this relates to the role of school counselors, and it made me think about the data that you showed, at least the emails that suggested the decision-making with parents was coming into play. So this questioner is asking about school counselors and how they might play a role in these decisions and supporting students or not in processing this information. Does any of your work or future plans kind of incorporate that space?
That's again what the intensive interviews with students. So what we're doing is we're interviewing students as well as their parents, as well as school administrators, to talk to them about college decision making and try to get a sense of whose behavior Hale is changing. One thing we saw was that the biggest effects were at places where nobody had applied to Michigan in years. And we can't tell from our data. We've got universal, we've got data for the whole state. It's thorough, it's complete, but it's just very, gross information. We don't have details about what's going on. So if a given school hasn't sent anyone to Michigan in years, is it because they don't have many school counselors and are not able to do the work of supporting students through the application process? Is there an active counseling group, but they're hostile MSU graduates, right? Is it that the counselors are great, but the parents are don't want students to travel all the way from the UP down to Southeast Michigan for college, right? So all of that is what we're getting at with the interviews. So stay tuned for tremendous research from doctoral students in our IES program, Institute for Education Sciences program, who are doing this research.
One more question and then a closing, wonderful closing comment. Considering the large effect on rural white students, I'm curious to know if there's been any research on their social emotional adjustment to Michigan, to U of M. What else is needed from an inclusion perspective? What are you learning?
We have not, there have been a few focus groups talking to students on the Michigan campus who were offered the Hale Scholarship to sort of, see what they thought about it, try to get some insights. Haven't done sort of the deep kind of qualitative interviews that I just described to you among students yet, right? And the way that we're doing, and what we'd like to do is keep following these high school seniors that we're now talking to as they not only go into University of Michigan, but also go into their other schools. Because we don't want to just talk to the ones who ended up at Michigan. You want to know, what about the ones who ended up at the other schools? Right? Because a big part of what's going on here and changing people's lives is that we've gotten them to the University of Michigan. Yes, University of Michigan can be difficult if you're a low-income student. I was a first-gen student at Harvard University. It was a difficult place to be a low-income student. The income inequality is just stark, and it's gobsmacking, and it's a difficult place to be a low-income student. But you know what? It's also difficult to be a low-income student at UMass Boston. So it's, and the question is, what kind of resources are we able to make available to students here that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise? Or Bunker Hill Community Colleges, great schools, but they don't have the resources Harvard does. So we want to make sure we're doing a full comparison and in looking at how people's lives have been changed. And we don't want to just focus on the ones who made it to the University of Michigan, but compare their lives to those who didn't.
This is, well, that response is a great segue to a comment that someone is offering. And if you ever have any doubt about why you do the work you do, which I don't think you do, but if you ever had one, this responder notes in Dr. Dynarski's bio, it said that she's been a mentor for master's and PhD students, but she's also been a mentor to me. I'm only an undergrad, and she took her time to help me understand how I could be successful applying to master's programs. My family is low income and I'm first gen too. I hope to be a professor mentor like her one day.
Paying it forward is what I feel like I've been trying to do for the since I graduated from Harvard. I was walking around Harvard as an undergraduate. I was just, you've said gobsmacked once already, but I was gobsmacked that I had that opportunity. And I have felt like I was given a blessing, and it's been my responsibility to pay it back. And so I feel anything I can do to try to equalize what's very starkly unequal in our society is an obligation.
Thank you, Professor Dynarski. Thank you, Sue, for your engaging talk, your discussion, and the commitment and the work that you've been doing to make an impact, and it has made an impact.
Thank you for the support and the recognition. It's been really wonderful.
And we will miss you here. But all the studies that you're going to do, that we're going to be inviting you back like 80,000 times to like,
yep, this work will go on. I'll be around. You won't get rid of me easily.
With that, I would like to close this event by thanking those in attendance, and also the event team, the planning team for this lectureship, and members of the University Diversity and Social Transformation Selection Committee for all of their efforts and for wonderfully being expert selectors. I hope that everyone gained something from this discussion, from the presentation and discussion, prompting you to maybe even learn even more. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.